Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Tatyan, and I'm a senior fellow with the Urban Institute's Metropolitan Housing and Community Center and research director for Urban Greater DC, Urban Institute's initiative focused on the district and the Washington region. I'll be moderating today's event in our Revitalizing and Reimagining the DMV After COVID-19 series. Before we start, some quick housekeeping. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterward. Speaker biographies are available online at urban.org, and a link to the bios will be posted in the chat. We have closed captions turned on. If you'd like to adjust your settings, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your Zoom window. All participants are muted, but you can send questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time, and we hope to have time for audience questions at the end. And finally, if you tweet about the event, please tweet using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. This Wednesday, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform will mark up and vote on H.R. 51, the DC statehood bill authored by DC Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. It will only be the second markup of the bill in Congress since 1993 and will occur just 2 days before DC Emancipation Day, the holiday celebrating the freeing of thousands of people held in bondage in the District of Columbia. Although the cause of DC statehood has recently gained national attention and momentum, the people of the district have been fighting this battle for more than 200 years. While conversations have largely focused on federal representation or the political impacts of the proposal, today we want to discuss how statehood could improve equity in the district. DC is a rapidly growing city, but the prosperity from our growth is not being shared equitably. According to the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, in 2018, the median income of households headed by Black people in DC was less than 1/3 that of white households. The district has been called one of the most gentrified cities in the country, and the Black population has dropped by more than 200,000 since 1970. The disparities between Black and white residents have also been acutely felt during the COVID-19 pandemic, as Black communities, particularly in Ward 7 and 8, have faced the brunt of both the health and economic impacts of the crisis. And tragically, our country is facing yet another case of a fatal police shooting of a Black man, 20-year-old Dante Wright, a further reminder of the life and death consequences of racism and inequality in our society. As a DC resident who has spent more than 20 years researching local issues, I'm very much looking forward to today's critical and timely conversation. Our panelists this afternoon will explain how DC's current status has shaped the lives of its residents, and we'll talk about the opportunities that statehood presents for communities across DC. So today, I'm honored to be joined by Bo Schuff, who is the executive director of DC Vote, a statehood advocacy group in the district. In Bo's 5 years with DC Vote, he is focused on achieving equality for the residents of DC. Prior to joining DC Vote, Bo spent 20 years in electoral and advocacy politics, working for a variety of organizations and campaigns, including Progressive Congress, Muriel Bowser's mayoral campaign, and the Human Rights Campaign. I'm also delighted to welcome Erica Williams, who is the new executive director of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, where her mission is to promote policy solutions that provide widespread opportunity for all DC residents. Erica spent over a decade at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, leading their state priorities partnership, and is an expert in developing equitable and inclusive state fiscal policies. Chris Myers-Ash is a visiting instructor at Colby College and the co-founder and executive director of the Capital Area New Mainers Project. He is co-author of Chocolate City, A History of Race and Democracy in the Nation's Capital, and also wrote The Senator and the Sharecropper, which tells the story of the struggle for Black equality in the 20th century. Most recently, he co-wrote with Dr. George Derek Musgrove, Democracy Deferred, Race, Politics, and DC's two-century struggle for full voting rights for the new Statehood Research DC Center. And finally, we're delighted to have Johnny Barnes, a lawyer who has focused his practice on civil rights and helping others. He was the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union for the nation's capital for over a decade, where he led efforts to resist the proliferation of video surveillance cameras in DC and to fight against proposed warrantless searches by the DC police. He continues to devote much of his time to the quest for DC statehood and predicts it will happen in our lifetime. So please join me in virtually welcoming all of our panelists. So first, let me turn to you, Bo. There's obviously been a lot of interest and activity in DC statehood this past year. Can you give us a quick update of where the fight for statehood currently stands?
Absolutely. Peter, thanks very much to you and to the Urban Institute for hosting this event and for including DC Vote. Also, thanks to the other panelists who I've worked with and known for a bit as well. It's nice to see familiar faces, and one day I hope to do so in person again. The fight for DC statehood, I like to say I'm cautiously optimistic in that we are the farthest forward we have ever been in the fight for statehood, yet with significant work and challenges to go. I do not believe that we can say that it's a done deal or that we should just count up the days until it passes, because there is a lot of work to do, but it is absolutely sitting at the best spot that we've got. As you mentioned, there'll be a markup and a vote in the committee on Wednesday. We will then see the vote on the House floor next week. It has been announced, the week of the 19th. I anticipate that either the Tuesday or Wednesday, the 20th or 21st. And then in the pivot is to the Senate. And even in the Senate, we stand a better chance than we've ever had before, with 44 co-sponsors, 46 known supporters in the Senate, and commitments from the majority leader, the vice president, and the president. So we're in a very strong position. The challenge is those last four to get from 46 to 50. And there's a lot of work to do and a lot of education to do across the country to get those last four and get us to a majority.
Great, thank you so much. Chris, let me turn to you now. In your writings, you've talked about the role race has played in decisions regarding the US Capitol, including where the new city of Washington, DC ended up being located. And obviously, we can't do justice to over 2 centuries of history in a few short minutes, but can you discuss some of the ways the racial makeup of DC and its residents have impacted the city's status and its political representation?
Sure, and thanks for hosting this this webinar, because I think this really is an exciting time. As Bo said, we've never been quite this far before, and even though there's still a lot of work to be done, it's exciting to be where we are. Of course, Derek Musgrove and I wrote about a lot of these issues in our book, Chocolate City, because race is really the central animating force of DC history and DC politics. Going back, as you mentioned, to the founding of the city, we are located, DC is located on the banks of the Potomac River in large part because of race, because of slavery, because the leadership of the nation at the time, the Southern leadership, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, wanted to have the nation's capital in the South, in plantation society, and particularly did not want it to be in Philadelphia, which was a leading contender at the time, because Philadelphia was the home not only of a growing anti-slavery movement, but also a very well-established free Black community. And so those leaders, those Virginians, worked very hard and eventually cut a deal with Alexander Hamilton and northern politicians to place the capital in the South, and not in an empty wilderness as the theory goes, or on this swamp, but actually right in the heart of plantation country. And there was already a plantation society located in the spot that became the nation's capital. And so race plays a role from the founding. Another time period that's really important that many people don't understand is Reconstruction, when Black men in DC were the first Black men to be granted the right to vote, and exercised it very forcefully. The very first vote in early 1867, they threw out the racist mayor of Georgetown and replaced him with someone more to their liking. They elected a white abolitionist as mayor of Washington City. The city council was an interracial body that passed the most progressive anti-discrimination laws in the country. And this is the late 1860s, early 1870s. Those laws later become the foundation of the post-World War II civil rights movement. But that exercise of Black political power when DC was on the forefront of racial change, where there was this flowering of interracial democracy, that worried folks in Congress, and Congress still held the power. And in 1874, basically strips the city of all voting rights for white folks and Black, in part because they're fearing Black political power. And this memory of Reconstruction as a time of turbulence and chaos and corruption, this kind of faulty interpretation of Reconstruction goes on for the next 70 years, really, to sabotage any efforts to win back the right to vote, both locally in home rule and any efforts at the national level. Because anytime there would be a coalition or a movement to win back full representation for DC, people would bring back what they called the specter of Reconstruction and the specter of Black domination, they called it, and that they worried that Black voters would hold the balance of power in a city that was split, where white voters would be split. And people didn't want that. I mean, even into the post-civil rights era, after DC gained the right to home rule, local municipal government in the 1970s, there was a push for a DC voting rights amendment to the Constitution. It actually passes both houses of Congress and goes to the states for ratification. And there it runs into this buzzsaw of conservative opposition, and much of that opposition was racial in nature. Pat Buchanan, the famous Pat Buchanan, was on the forefront. He's a DC native, and he was on the forefront of opposition. He called it an affirmative action program. Of course, at that time, as now, that was a code word for giving Black people unearned rights. And he said, we don't want to throw away the Constitution to give Julian Bond a Senate seat. So opposition, a lot of it rooted in racial anxieties, undermined the DC Voting Rights Act, and it never got ratification in the states, and so it died in the early 80s. And so now race and party identification are so closely linked, particularly in urban areas like DC, that opponents of DC statehood don't even have to bring up race necessarily. They can just talk about Democrats, urban Democrats, and that suffices, right? That energizes their base to oppose this, again, largely on racial grounds, although the terms are not as explicit as they once were.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you again. Yes, and there's a lot in that history that you said, things that we may remember, things that maybe we haven't. So thank you for sharing more of that with us. Johnny, you've had an incredible career fighting for civil rights in DC, so experienced firsthand some of that history Chris was talking about, and have been a longtime advocate for DC statehood, which again, you predicted will happen in our lifetime. So how have you seen the city's status impact residents and their civil rights, particularly the rights of Black residents?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be on this very knowledgeable and dedicated panel. The topic today reminds me of a series of hearings Ron Dellums held when he was chair of the House District Committee, and one was raised the question, can DC afford to be a state? And the first witness was Dr. Andrew Brimmer, who was at that time on the Federal Reserve Board, and he turned the question around and said, can DC afford not to be a state? Because of the impact of not being a state on the fiscal position of the District of Columbia. Second witness was Senator Inouye of Hawaii, who talked about the windfall that Hawaii experienced once it became a state, a tremendous windfall. And the third was, of course, a renowned local attorney, Matt Watson, who was the DC auditor at the time, who did a side-by-side and showed the tremendous boost in income DC would get if we were a state as opposed to our current status. And earlier, as you know, Peter, President Trump withheld $750,000 from us in COVID funding because we were not a state. Wrongfully withheld, I might quickly add. $750,000 is $250,000 more than our entire police department budget. It's slightly under our entire public school budget. It's a chunk of change. It's a lot of money, and we didn't get it just because we were a state. So to talk about what would happen if we become a state. It's where the rubber meets the road. It would help us tremendously, especially with the disparities between poor people and those who have. It would help us tremendously with all of the funding that we need, especially in this COVID period. So the question is, can we afford a state?
Great, thank you so much, Johnny. Some really great points there. And Erica, I'll turn to you next. And of course, the DC's fiscal situation is front and center in the work of your organization. And we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating for communities across the country. And local governments face the huge challenge of promoting inclusive recovery in its aftermath. You've written about strategies that state governments can adopt to build an anti-racist and equitable response to the pandemic to ensure that this crisis does not worsen racial inequities as other crises have in the past. How does DC's current status affect the local government's ability to deploy strategies like those and organize an effective COVID-19 response and recovery?
Thanks so much, Peter. Yeah, and thanks to everyone on the panel for the amazing work that you do for DC Statehood. That paper you mentioned, Peter, that we wrote, the outlining 3 principles for an anti-racist, equitable state response to this crisis and to our recovery in order to set ourselves up for a better future, right? We'd like to not wind up here again, really emphasizes what a pivotal moment we're in, both because of the racial disparities that you mentioned and impact of this crisis. You know, the fact that if you're Black or Indigenous, a person of color, if you're an immigrant, if you're a low-wage worker, you know, you were already more likely to struggle, good times and bad times, and you're in this moment more vulnerable to the worst consequences of this crisis and others that are to come. You know, it's also a real opportunity and something we emphasize to take a leap forward if we're willing and focused on the anti-racist and equitable state policy choices that could be made. Of course, you know, our ability to do that is some about lawmaker will, some about advocacy, but it also, in the case of DC, has to do with statehood. And so just a few examples, and Mr. Barnes, you sort of stole some of my talking points, so that's okay. But the first principle we laid out is to target aid to those most in need due to the pandemic and the consequent economic crisis. And this really means making sure that we're prioritizing support for folks that are being hit the hardest, essential workers who are putting themselves at risk to keep things going. Folks who, due to lack of public investment, economic inequality, historic and ongoing racism and discrimination, already are experiencing health and economic insecurity long before the crisis began. So folks who are experiencing homelessness, we have a real homelessness issue in DC, or just housing instability or hunger, so forth, or unemployment. So that money that we did not get through the CARES Act, that we were shortchanged, could have provided for a much more robust response. We could have had more cash assistance going to folks who were unable to find work. We could have done more to set up childcare and to prop up the childcare industry that we are desperately going to need when we come back, when we all come back to work, but that essential need workers have needed all along. You know, all kinds of things we could have done with $750,000. We unfortunately only got a little under 500 million, while states like Wyoming and Vermont and all the rest of the states in the country got 1.25 billion as a baseline to meet the moment and pay for rising costs due to COVID. The second principle we laid out is about using this moment to advance policies that can dismantle persistent racial, gender, and economic inequities. This is a chance to make progress for the future. One of the historic wrongs that DC has been ready to make right, we've been ready to right, but can't do on our own without statehood, is around the criminalization of cannabis use. So the district's Black and Brown communities still very much endure the harmful effects of past policies that penalize cannabis use and criminalize communities around that use. And while we've been able to decriminalize use of cannabis to some degree, we can't move forward with without statehood, we can't move forward to fully legalize the sale and regulate the use of cannabis without congressional action. And so statehood would give us the autonomy that we should already have to make those kinds of decisions for ourselves, and in ways that can repair harm done to Black and Brown communities who bore the brunt of the racist war on drugs in this country. And the third principle we lay out in the paper is to protect state finances to preserve our foundations for long-term economic growth and opportunity. That's our schools, that's our healthcare, that's economic supports for folks who are struggling to get by so that everybody's able to contribute to this economy. And lack of statehood actually limits our ability to do this. As Mr. Barnes mentioned, there is income tax that is foregone for us because we're not a state. Every other state in the country is able to, and does, as a matter of course, tax non-resident income earned within their borders. We here in the district are not allowed to do this. And the last estimate I saw around this is that it costs about $2.2 billion a year. That's no small chunk of change for the District of Columbia and could be put to really great use. We all know that we have far more need to be met in this city than we have dollars going toward those needs. So I would also just note that it's not just that we can't tax non-resident income with our current tax structure, but that if we were to gain statehood and be able to have those non-residents who are earning income in this district would then become a part of our income tax base that we could use to raise revenue when we need to in the future. So it's about now, but it's also about the future. And then the last thing I'll mention is that lack of statehood has left us with about $500 million in federally mandated reserves, or sort of rainy day funds. Reserves that we're supposed to be able to use when times are bad, like now, but that are restricted in ways that make them not particularly usable during a downturn. And if we were a state, that's $500 million that we could write our own rules for, right? And determine how we want to use those dollars, when and how to replenish them. And so I just lay that out as another example of where we are limited in the tools we have to meet this moment and to set ourselves up for the future. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Erica. That was a very thorough overview of a lot of ways in which statehood could be very important to the people living in DC. And Bo, Erica and Johnny talked about some of the things that ways in which the rights of DC citizens have been impacted, our ability to control decisions that are made that affect us. Are there some other examples that you can talk about of ways that congressional oversight or interference and lack of federal representation has hurt DC over the years?
Sure, I'd be happy to expand on that. Let me clarify one point though. CARES didn't short us $750,000 with an M. It shorted us $750 million with a B. And I know that both the panelists know that very, very well. But for the folks who are watching, I want to make sure that that's clarified because it's 1,000 times more important, literally.
Yes, indeed.
So, and the impact of the lack of that funding that Johnny talked about, it literally cost Washingtonians their lives in the inability to seek care and to seek medical services. And right now we're seeing it in our shortage of vaccine doses, as was pointed out in a recent Atlantic article, that if we were a state, we would not be lagging behind most of the states in the way that we were administering COVID-19 vaccines. And what's sad is that this is not the first time that congressional oversight and interference has killed Washingtonians. We saw it decades ago when we were denied the ability to institute a needle exchange program in the height of the HIV and AIDS crisis. For 10 years, that program was blocked, and literally the day that the block was lifted, we saw transmission rates and infection rates among intravenous drug users plummet. So multiple times, and I'm sure that Chris could point out even more times that congressional interference has cost the lives of Washingtonians. it isn't all that dire, but it's all the time, but it is always an impact. And we have seen it in non-discrimination ordinances, whether or not we could provide domestic partner benefits to city employees. We went so far as to see congressional interference in how we label wet wipes here in the district, literally how we label wet wipes about whether or not they can be flushed down the toilet. The Congress decided we can't decide that on our own. We don't have the intellect, I guess, to decide whether a wet wipe is flushable or not. Never mind, let's worry about what's called a fatberg and the danger to folks who work in the sewer system who are dealing with these wet wipes when they aren't flushable. So we've seen it at the minor little levels that impact a small number of people and a huge impact on our economy, like wet wipes, to massive levels that truly do kill Washingtonians. And it's an everyday occurrence. Right now, we talked about marijuana. We didn't talk yet about the fact that we still can't use local dollars to fund abortion care for low-income women. There are blocks still in place. And even more beyond that is we don't know the things that we could have done, because the council approaches every decision with this eye of, will Congress let us do that? Will Congress let us care for our residents the way we want to care for them, the way we know we can pay for, the way we've decided our priorities are? And every single time they make a decision, it's in their back of their head, will Congress let us do that? So we're not even completely ever sure of all of the things that could have been here in the district were we to have the equality that everyone else has.
Great, thank you, Bo. And yes, I'm sure there are many more examples we could talk about. I want to just, before asking the next question, just want to remind everyone that you can type your questions and comments in the Q&A box, and so we're seeing a few already, and we will be turning to those a little bit later. Chris, wanted to go back to you, and with the displacement of Black residents and growing economic inequalities across the district, DC, of course, looks very different today than it did a few decades before. Can you talk about the legacy of displacement in the city and how that may connect with statehood?
Sure. You know, one of the things that I always find interesting is when people talk about displacement and gentrification, they act as if this is a 21st century phenomenon. That we've never seen this before. Oh my gosh, and it in DC certainly it goes way, way back, and a lot of it is tied to the fact that DC is a creature of Congress and largely has had little power to stop Congress or Congress working in concert with developers or the city commissioners working together with developers in ways that displace people who have no power. You can go back to the famous McMillan plan in the early 20th century that basically laid out downtown DC as we know it, with the monuments and the mall and all, the grandeur of the federal city. That was all planned out. Those were low income, often interracial neighborhoods downtown that were displaced, that were destroyed. I mean, the whole area around Union Station was a low income, largely Irish immigrant community that was destroyed and displaced to build Union Station. Those decisions were made without any input from local DC residents because they had no power. Developers and Congress worked with 3 local commissioners, all of whom were white men until the 1960s, and they made the decisions that displaced thousands of people. Fast forward to the post-World War II era, as the local DC civil rights movement is gaining steam. At the same time, there's a push among developers, policymakers, businessmen and folks in the press to implement what was called urban renewal. This was the latest thing. Again, this was implemented in DC without any local input. Why? Because we had no power, because DC was under the control of Congress. And so they were able to implement urban renewal, which basically wiped out the entire quadrant of Southwest and replaced a low income mixed race neighborhood with high rises that were catering largely to middle and upper middle class residents, the majority of whom were white. And so the racial dynamics of Southwest flipped in just a decade from largely Black to largely white. And that was driven by policymakers who had no democratic accountability because there was no power. You mentioned how the city has changed significantly, certainly in terms of racial and economic dynamics in the last 20 or 30 years. And when this process started to happen in the 90s and early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, many of my DC friends, it was interesting. They would come to me and say, look, now that DC is becoming wealthier and whiter, maybe statehood has a chance because Congress listens more to those voices than to the folks who are being displaced. And it's interesting because statehood has gained a lot of currency now that it's never had before. But what I find interesting actually is that the power and the energy that's driving the movement is actually not coming from those new residents and those voices. It's coming because of the racial justice movement that was ignited last summer. And that's the reason that it's on the national agenda. So while I understand the concerns about displacement, in fact, I mean, I think what makes this a particularly resonant issue right now at this moment in our politics is because there's a racial reckoning going on. There's a racial justice movement that's forcing Americans to think anew about some basic inequities that we have taken for granted for too long. And so, I think that's what's driving this latest push.
Great, thank you, Chris. Yes, and Johnny, I mean, you have been, again, one of the folks on the front line of that racial justice fight for some time. Can you talk to us about the connection between the DC Statehood campaign and the voting rights movement in America? Are there parallels and connections between these two movements that we should understand?
Absolutely. I like to piggyback very quickly on some of the points because I think this isn't an academic exercise. This isn't about more politicians getting positions. This is about our lives and livelihood. As Erica pointed out, every state in the union has a right to enact to tax income at its source. Everybody except us. In addition, every state has the right to impose a commuter tax. You can't get into New York without paying. You can't get out of New York without paying. On your way to New York through Maryland and Baltimore, you can't get in or out of Baltimore without paying. Yet we can't pay. Virginia, I think you pay every 2 blocks out there. So that impacts us heavily, in addition to the more than $2 billion that we lose because of the inability to tax income at its source. But we also can't tax certain valuable land that Congress over the years, their little pet projects like Constitution Hall, Daughters of the American Revolution. We know they discriminated for years. That's a lot of money out of our pockets. And so Dr. Bremer was right. Can we afford not to be a state? It's ironic that the 2 senators who will make the difference if we can get past the filibuster on this DC statehood vote came because the people in Georgia fought to maintain the franchise. Women couldn't vote at one time, and we fixed that. Blacks couldn't vote at one time, and we fixed that. Young people could go to war and could not vote. They could die and couldn't vote, and we fixed that. All that was done by constitutional amendment, which requires 2/3 of the House and Senate. And the franchise is so important in America that you could live in Russia. And if you're still an American citizen, you can vote in our elections. Soldiers who spend time in the bitter cold hills of Afghanistan or the hot sands of Iran, they can vote because we have made a way for them to vote. The only people in the whole wide world who live in in the whole wide world who can't vote are the people who live in Washington, D.C. So this movement to make sure that everybody can vote has to include Washington, D.C. because we're the last real true voting rights struggle in the world.
Thank you so much, Johnny. It's a great perspective to bring to this. Erica, if and when statehood passes, what would you like to see as some of the key pieces of legislation or policy priorities that DC will need to take on to improve equity in the district?
Well, I think some of those I mentioned would count here. So taxing non-resident income. I'm all for a commuter tax. Legalization and regulation and taxation of cannabis, is another. I think if we, when, as someone the other day was like, it's not if, it's when we are a state, we will likely need to take on the criminal justice system for DC. And I think that could be paid for out of the taxation of income, and will allow us to think about how we better serve returning citizens and make that a more equitable process. So there's things to think about around that. I also just think there's so much possibility for advocates here and residents here in the district to engage at the federal level once we're a state, right? Think about all the things that we could be advocating for that would be game changers for us here in the district. I think about things like, what if our voting representatives and in Congress were able to put forth new proposals to make housing a right, to make housing an entitlement, much like we do with SNAP, where if you need it, you get it. And what a game changer that would be for the District of Columbia, where housing affordability and access is such a big barrier to folks being able to live here and live good lives here, right? I think of other possibilities might be, having those voting, our representatives in Congress put forward proposals for things like a national subsidized jobs program that is ongoing, not just in times of emergency through some TANF funds, but ongoing and robust to help us deal with the fact that, we have a lot of opportunity for some folks, a lot of them white and well-educated, and a lot of disadvantage for a lot of Black and brown folks in this town. And we don't have much of a bridge between the two. We can see that in where we see Black and brown folks most likely to be working in the District of Columbia versus white folks, right? Big income differences. You mentioned the big gap in median household income. Here, the unemployment rate for Black folks in this town is 4.5 times that of white residents. It's just huge. And so what if we had the opportunity for a big federal program like that could be a game changer for us here in the district and really put us on better footing and grow our economy ultimately over time. So I like to think about the big opportunities that could be on the horizon, and like the excitement that people might have, people all across the city might have about the fact that they now have the right to vote and can participate in these processes and get to make themselves heard and seen. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I also think Bo's right that there's the things we haven't done that we don't even know we haven't done because we had the politics and power of Congress sort of hanging over our heads. And so there's likely other ways we could go that we haven't even dreamed of yet.
Great, thank you so much. Bo, let me turn again to you as the head of an advocacy organization that has been fighting for statehood since the 90s. This has been a long fight. You talked about that. Can you tell us why you think now seems to be a critical moment, and why has the national momentum changed?
Yeah, sure. I just put in the chat the most recent polling that we saw released by CBS News a couple weeks ago. And I frame it that way. One, there was also a question in the questions that somebody wondered, but the polling is important because for the first time ever, we are running from ahead. We're running from in front of this effort. We have now gained a majority in support at 54% across the country. And that's a massive shift. I was lucky enough to be born in the DMV, and then I was taken away by my parents, but I grew up on the beaches of Southern California. I am super lucky, and I get it. And I just footnote, I came back as soon as I could 30 years ago to go to college, and have been here ever since. But one thing I learned growing up is that you can have a really good surfer, and you can have a really good wave, and you can have an amazing weather, and you can have all the right conditions. And unless those all line up at the exact right moment, you are still going to wipe out. And I think that we have had over the course of years, the right conditions sometimes, and the right surfer at sometimes, and the right weather at sometimes, and the right wave at sometimes. But it feels like now is one of the best shots to put all of those pieces together at the right moment and really actually get this thing done. There's been 209 years of work. It shouldn't be 211, right? Like, let's just do it. Let's just get this thing done. The conditions are there. There are pieces still to put in the puzzle, and that's up to everybody who's on this call, who's involved with the organizations represented on this panel. It is not a thing that can be done by the folks in DC. It's a thing that can be done by the folks outside of DC, because we need help educating friends and neighbors and elected officials across the country. But I do think we are at that point of putting all the pieces together and getting this thing across the finish line. There's no finish line in surfing, but I haven't figured out what the end of that metaphor is.
All right, thanks for the metaphors, perfect as it was. So I'd like to give each of our panelists just a little time, 30 seconds or so, to give some last thoughts before we turn to the questions from our audience. And so there are some questions coming in, so I want to let folks know, in addition to asking questions, you can also vote for questions that someone else has asked, and that will help us as we sort of prioritize the questions we want to put to our panel. So please take a look at that. But let me start with Chris, and then move to Johnny, Erica, and then Bo for just some last quick thoughts before we go to the questions.
Sure. You know, I think DC statehood really is a moral issue. It should be about fairness and equality and democracy, and not about politics, which I think is how many folks have framed it. But the historian in me wants to point out that statehood is always about politics. There's never been an apolitical admission of a state into the union. And you'll hear lots of opponents of DC statehood talk about this power grab. You know, this is a power grab. It's just Democrats wanting to add seats to the Senate and so forth. And the reality is that statehood has always been about power. And you know, the very Republicans who oppose statehood derive their power in large part due to what might be called a power grab in the late 19th century. So in the late 19th century, starting in the middle of the Civil War, Republican majorities in the Senate and the House rammed through 11 states. All that red territory that you see on all those maps, those were all rammed through in the late 19th century, including a state, West Virginia, whose senator is blocking so much, that was carved out of another state that did not want it to be carved out. Nevada, which only had 21,000 residents, and to this day, 85% of Nevada land is owned by the federal government. You had North and South Dakota, which were one territorial government, and the Republicans decided they wanted 4 senators, not 2, so they split it in half. There were 6 states that were pushed into statehood in 1 year, between 1889 and 1890. So those 11 states, which collectively have less than half the population of California, those 11 states account for 22% of the Senate, right? 22 votes in the Senate. And those 22 senators are almost unanimously against DC statehood. And so if we want to talk historically about politics and power when it comes to statehood, we have to acknowledge that the reason why there's such an imbalance of power and why rural Western states are so vastly overrepresented in our government, you have to go back to the late 19th century and look at that power grab.
Great, thank you, Chris. Johnny, you're next.
Since we're losing billions of dollars because we're not a state, the people of Washington, D.C. have to get woke. We put 150,000 people on the west lawn of the Capitol. Stevie Wonder sang a song, and a little boy carried a sign that said, "Pass the bill." That's in the wake of Reagan saying he would never sign the Martin Luther King holiday bill because King was a communist. A bunch of senators saying they would not support the bill. The bill passed, Reagan signed it. If we get woke and show that we want our billions that we're entitled to, like everybody else, we can meet the Murkowski challenge and we can become a state. Get out in the streets, people, get to work. Quit sitting on your couches just because of COVID.
All right, a call to action. Thank you very much. Erica.
I love that. Just flex some muscle. So, you know, I think one of the things I've made a point of talking about when I've been out and about talking to folks about tax policy and racial justice is just this, what I think is a basic truth, that if we're not intentional about undoing past and ongoing harms, then we are at best maintaining status quo, a status quo that does not work for a lot of people, Black, brown, and white. And at worst, we're exacerbating the harms of past discriminatory policies and practices. So I think we have to remain really laser focused on that in our current context. And as we're thinking about this moment in time and how hard we want to push and fight for statehood, I think it's incredibly important. And you could not look at this, this issue and say that this wouldn't be undoing past and ongoing harm, right, to residents of this district and the communities we're trying to build here. So I just would leave it at that.
Thank you. Bo?
I think I don't remember who, Peter, it might have been you that touched on it, or actually I think it was Chris, talking about the fact that the support for DC statehood has grown over the last couple of years because of how intertwined it is with the racial justice movements that we're seeing across the country. And I think that that's important, but it is doubly so because it's also intertwined with the voting rights issues that we are seeing move across this country. And it is the combination of the two of them, I think, that has gotten us to where we are now at a majority in support of DC statehood. And that's because at the end of the day, DC's lack of statehood is what I call a walking, breathing example of white supremacy. We have a majority Black and brown district that is governed solely by a majority white body, the United States Congress. And so if we are going to operate in an anti-racist mentality and the idea that we have to tear down structures of inequality and of racism, it cannot just be around HR 1 and HR 4, the two bills that help us get back to a spot with representation. We also have to move forward with representation and representing people who have never been so before, and that's DC statehood. So if we're truly going to be anti-racist, if we're truly going to fix the election issues that we have, if we're truly going to recognize how those two systems support each other and expand each other, we have to be in support of DC statehood as well.
Great. Thank you all very much for those very thoughtful and insightful responses and thoughts you shared today. So I'm going to turn to some of the audience questions. In the democratic spirit of our conversation today, I'm going to go with questions that have gotten more votes from the audience, starting with this question from John Whitman, who points out, you know, not only the Black-white disparities, but also disparities, say, between Ward 3 and Ward 8 are so huge. How do we see these disparities being resolved once statehood is achieved? Would anyone like to think about that? Comment on that.
I think that's
Johnny?
well, I mean, obviously, if we have more resources for jobs and training and economic opportunity and for businesses, and with the tsunami coming with foreclosures and evictions, we can do something about those problems. If we're losing so much money that if we had it, it would pay for our police department, our public schools, our healthcare system. Come on. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that statehood is the answer to the differences and the disparities in the District of Columbia. And I think they can be overcome if we have the resources to do so. And by the way, Ward 7 and Ward 8 are in the crosshairs of developers these days. A lot's going on out there, and we just need resources to help it come along.
Great, thank you very much. This next question from Yamuna Dasarapi, apologies if I get your name wrong, more on the political line. So as you were talking about, Chris, there's politics always involved in any statehood battle. How do you respond to Republican objection that DC will add 2 Democratic senators if given statehood? And so I think some of your remarks earlier might be a partly response to that, but do you have any other thoughts about?
Sure. I mean, I think, I think the DC statehood movement is strongest when it makes the moral argument, that this is about equality and some basic rights of citizenship and no taxation without representation. But I don't think we should pretend as if politics doesn't matter. You know, when Republicans object to that, you know, the response is yes. And, you know, does that mean that Democratic voters in DC, because they're going to vote Democratic, therefore should not be allowed to exercise their rights? I mean, we don't say that about Wyoming residents, even though there are fewer of them than DC, or Vermont residents. You know, if they want to vote for a socialist for Senate, that's okay, right? That's their right? That's the whole point. And so I guess I don't see that as a very strong objection. And I know that in years past, there's been an effort to try to create some balance, like the crazy Utah scheme, you know, 15 years ago. And I think that dilutes the message, because that really then makes it an argument about tit for tat politics, when we are talking about a fundamental right here that should not be abridged for reasons of partisanship or for race or for any other reason. And so, yeah, I guess I don't find the Republican objection very persuasive, particularly given, as I talked about, what happened in the late 19th century to create the imbalanced and undemocratic structure of our current, you know, current composition of the Senate.
I mean, if I can just add,
Yeah, please.
opposition to how we will use our representation is just one of a grab bag of racist dog whistles that opponents of statehood like to use. They go to whether or not we have enough blue collar workers or miners or fishermen, or whether or not we have bowling alleys or car dealerships, or whether or not we should just get stuck back to Maryland. They are all in the same exact category. You don't get to decide for us how we use our representation or who should be represented. Our American values are that all are represented. And just like Alabama and Mississippi have had two senators the entire time, whether or not they have been Dixiecrat Democrats or right-wing Republicans, they get to choose. And so do we. And that's what it is we just want to be like everyone else, whether or not we are black, white, or brown.
Great, thank you both very much. Jose Riera asks, in light of similar racial, political, and economic issues that affect both territories, as you've discussed, would there be any benefit in considering joint efforts with Puerto Rico on DC statehood discussion, and perhaps some of the other US territories like US Virgin Islands and so forth? So, Bo, I wonder if there's something you got, because I know you're also looking at mutual supporting of other movements, and so what is your thoughts on how Puerto Rico and other territories might relate to DC situation?
Yeah, the basic tenet of it is that any population that would like to be represented based on their own self-determination should be represented. And that's where the question gets a little bit muddier in some of the other locations than it does here in DC. Here in DC, we went to the polls, 86% of the population said we want to be a state. They did it in the same format that all the previous states since Tennessee have did it. We haven't seen that same clarity in the other territories, and specifically in Puerto Rico, where there's a bit of concern that the statehood party in Puerto Rico uses statehood referenda as GOTV methods for their own election. So the last referendum in November had 52% support in Puerto Rico. That's sort of not the same level of mandate that we saw in DC. Ultimately, we need to get a clear answer from residents of Puerto Rico. What does the residents of Puerto Rico desire? And then we would back it no matter what it was. And there are a couple of different ideas on the table with Puerto Rico. So it's a little bit different. One key difference also to note, because the person who posed the question asked about taxation, is the individual income tax is not paid in Puerto Rico, federal individual income tax. So it's not quite the same taxation without representation, although I do believe fully in the self-determination of Puerto Rico.
If I could hop in here just to add on to a little twist, because you'll sometimes hear people, and bringing it back to DC, hear people say, you know, why not go back to Maryland, what we call retrocession back to Maryland. And the same principle that Bo is talking about applies there. And the simple answer to that is because the people of DC don't want it, right? And the people of Maryland don't want it either. And retrocession happened with Virginia back in the 1840s. In that case, the eligible voters, restricted though the voting populace was, the eligible voters in that part of Virginia, or that part of the district, and the voters, the representatives in Virginia, both wanted retrocession, and so Congress approved it. It's a very different situation than what we have now. And that example, by the way, shows that Congress has the power to shrink the size of the federal capital, because people will say, well, the Constitution says that we have to have this federal district. It does, but it doesn't say how big that has to be. Just can't be any bigger than 10 miles square. It's already less than 10 miles square because Congress decided to give part of it back to Virginia. So we can shrink it down to the 2 miles square that encompasses the Capitol complex, and the rest becomes a new state. And that's what the residents of the district want, and that's what they should have.
Great, thank you very much. I think we have time for one last question here. And maybe both Johnny and Erica, this might be something you can touch on, because of course we talked about some of the financial benefits that could come to DC being a state, but Sinit Zacharias asks if and once DC becomes a state, how can we be certain the funding and support will go to the right communities? What can be done to achieve this?
I mean, I'll just jump in and say, I don't think that these are issues that crop up with statehood. These are issues we already face, right, with our current structure. We need to just do better in getting the resources to the place that they're most needed. I think we will need to have an eye toward, what higher education access looks like once we get to statehood. But that is not an unsolvable problem and something that we can raise resources for. I think we'll also need to make our case for keeping our Medicaid matching rate, right? That we have the need and that we should be able to keep that or something akin to that. But I think, making sure that no harm is done and that we are getting resources to the right places is just the job of DC residents and advocates every day, statehood or not. So I would just urge us to be as active and as engaged as possible. And like I said before, I would hope that with sort of the excitement and the just the reaffirmation of our right to be engaged in the processes, the political and economic processes that we should be involved in, that we might see some renewed energy around how we are prioritizing our tax dollars to the places that they're most needed.
I, of course, endorse everything Erica said. I do want to throw out a radical thing based upon some earlier thought. When the Home Rule Bill was passed, Congress put in it, because they have exclusive legislative authority over us, that only 2 of the 4 at-large seats can go to Democrats. And the courts upheld that. I worked on the Hill for a quarter of a century of my life. And maybe we ought to think about saying that only 1 of the seats can go to a Democrat in the Senate. Now, if we do that, once we become a state, we can undo that. That's the Oklahoma bill that the Supreme Court decided. But if the resistance is so rigid because of the fear of 2 Democrats coming from Georgia and then 2 Democrats coming from DC, maybe we ought to be a little creative. I leave that to the social engineers who are much more bright than I.
Okay. I don't think I'm going to comment on that one either, but thank you for throwing out I think it's good to get a lot of ideas out there. So yeah, thank you to everybody. Thank you first to our panelists for this has been a fantastic discussion. And thank you to everyone who asked questions. I'm sorry, I know we didn't get to a lot of the questions that you folks asked, but I appreciate Bo has shared his contact information. And I know there was a couple of questions about how can I be involved in helping promote DC statehood. And I would say, follow the folks on this panel who are active in this movement and follow them on social media or other means to learn about ways that you can engage more on this issue. And I'm sure this is not the last. We're going to be talking about this as well. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Look for future events in this series coming from the Urban Institute, and we will welcome you at those as well. So thank you, and everyone have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Peter.
You all.